Get us started, we have our information here for our website, readingscience.org, which you probably visited to register for this webinar. We also have the option to become a member. It gives you priority registration to our MSJ Summer Conference. You have a quarterly newsletter that you would receive. We have members only events. And then I think the most exciting membership benefit has been the scholarly access to journals. So really being able to research topics that you are more interested in learning about in education. So anything from learning about how reading develops to using decodable text to vocabulary instruction. So lots of great journal access there. And then also our graduate programs. You can see listed there everything from a reading science certificate to the doctorate of education, which Renata has just finished this past year. So thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to go ahead and let Renata take it from here.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Very happy you've joined, and thank you for coming to this webinar. I will mention there was a webinar last week that connects directly to what we're going to be talking about and hearing about this evening. That was last week with Larissa, my colleague, and Dr. Murdoch, who should be joining later. So I did want to ask everyone, and Larissa can read them out, to drop in the chat where you are, because I think we have people in different locations. What your role is, are you in service? Are you retired? Are you a classroom teacher, administrator? Just to see who's here. And then I'll introduce myself properly. So Larissa, if you can read out anything that you're seeing in the chat.
Interventionist in Wyoming, MTSS specialist in Atlanta, Georgia for grades K to 5. It's Ashley. Intervention specialist from Columbus, Ohio. We have a Title I teacher from North Carolina. I'm probably saying this wrong, but Currituck County Schools. We have someone from New York City, a district administrator here.
Awesome. Okay,
Lots
and
of
there are
school leaders.
Yes, and there are two special people in the chat in our meeting that who are retired educators. They might be typing right now. One of them is my aunt, who is a retired kindergarten teacher, and one of them is my mom, who's a retired music and classroom educator and school administrator. So they jumped on too. And so just a little bit about me. Before I get started, I have over 25 years in the field of education, and most of those years as a kindergarten teacher. And I spent some time as a literacy coach. And currently, I work at the district level supporting 19 schools here in Brooklyn, New York. I'm also a faculty member at Mount St. Joseph University in the Reading Science graduate program. And as Larissa just said, I received my doctorate from Mount St. Joe with a concentration in reading science, and my research interests lie in the intersection of literacy, MTSS, assessment, and school leadership, as you can see. And this is a photo of my mom and I, Angela. And on the other side, some fun facts. I am not originally from New York City, where I live now. I've been here 28 years. I'm from the California Bay Area. And as you can see, I'm also a proud USC Trojan mom. So what I wanted to do before I get into the presentation was to just define a term, because I know we have a few people here, not a large group, but varying levels of experience. I see from interventionists to MTSS specialists to educators who may not have heard this term before. So I don't want to get started and start saying the term MTSS and not everyone understand what I mean because it's going to be something I talk about often. So the term, here's a little definition. MTSS stands for multi-tiered systems of support. So it's a school-wide framework for implementing effective instruction. And MTSS involves efficiently targeting instruction to student needs based on a school-wide assessment system. So that's what it's a way of doing things in a school and encompasses many components. And I will, at the end of the presentation, get around to talking about that. And here's one other thing that's important about MTSS. It says with a proactive MTSS framework, students receive timely, evidence-based interventions on a continuum of low to high intensity based on students' individual needs to prevent more serious academic outcomes. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that now. So as I get started and I start saying the term, in case you hadn't heard it before, I'm sure you're familiar with the practices that I'm talking about. So the purpose of this presentation, before I share the learning objectives, is to establish a common understanding or consensus on some important elements that are impacting our ability to address the literacy crisis in the nation right now. And it's an opportunity to connect the dots by considering some historical context that has contributed to a lack of diversity in the principalship and may give us some insight into how to address the needs of groups of students who have been disproportionately impacted by the literacy crisis. And last, it gives us an opportunity to consider the implications of the research I'm going to share, clear up some common misconceptions about MTSS, and think about what your next steps might be in your school community. So we're going to go down a few rabbit holes together, but we're going to come right back around to MTSS at the end and what we can do next in our own school or district. So here are the learning objectives. We're going to together explore research on principal impact on learning outcomes, examine data that reflects the current literacy crisis that's impacting every US state and disproportionately impacting Black, Hispanic, multilingual, and special needs students. We're going to explore the findings from 3 recent studies on principal literacy and MTSS knowledge, and the rationale now and historical context for my recent study. We'll look at the overall implications for the field, and then discuss MTSS basics and common misunderstandings. And at the end, I'm gonna explore the next steps that we're taking here in New York City in my small district, and think about some things that you can start with if you haven't gotten started with this, and let you share some of what's going on in your lives right now with relation to these topics. So any questions you have, please drop them in the chat, and Larissa will either answer or hold on to them so we can discuss them at the end. All right, so we're all partners in navigating a national reading crisis that has disproportionately impacted various groups. So while we have a wealth of research on teacher impact and teacher knowledge, the role of school leaders in systemic transformation often goes overlooked. So let's take a look at some research findings that answer this question. What impact does successful leadership have? So a number of studies have established a link between principal practice and student achievement. The review of evidence, there was a review of evidence done by Lathwood and colleagues in 2004, and Grissom and colleagues for the foundation, the Wallace Foundation in 2021. I'm going to have a QR code that you can zap to pull up that report. And so the research they did, that they compiled, shows that successful leadership, successful principals have an indirect but significant effect on student and school effectiveness. Successful principals contribute to student learning through their influence on other people or features of their organization, and they shape a school's instructional climate. So one thing that the Wallace Foundation report pinpointed was that a leader's contribution to student learning depended a great deal on their judicious choice of what parts of their organization to spend time and attention Somebody's unmuted. Okay. And some things that they paid attention to paid off more than others. So here's a nice quote from that one of that report. Effective leadership can significantly improve student learning and is second only to classroom instruction in its impact on student achievement. So that's pretty heavy to know that after the classroom teacher, the principal has the most impact on a student. So like the last quote said, effective principals are an essential force in systemic transformation, collaborative practices, high quality engagement with teachers around instruction, and the use of frameworks like MTSS to cultivate an environment where students thrive. So other findings in that review of the literature noted that unfortunately, many schools, often the neediest schools, do not have the benefit of skilled leadership, and that diversity in the principalship has been slow to grow, and most students of color are less likely to ever encounter a same race principal. And we're going to talk more about why this is really important later on in the presentation. So here's the QR code, and also I put a tiny URL there in case, where you can see the report, the Wallace Foundation. They are all about compiling information that's related to school leadership. So this quote says, at the classroom level, substantial evidence suggests that student learning varies as a consequence of class size, student grouping practices, and instructional practices of teachers, and the nature and extent of monitoring of student progress. So these elements are in the locus of control of a school leader, and they are very related to the components of MTSS we'll talk about later. So let's transition and take a look at what some of you may be familiar with, and some of you, this might be new information, at our nation's data. So now that we know what effective school leadership can produce, what is happening with our students and even adult literacy in our nation? And this is information we should definitely, if you haven't seen it, take it back to your school community. It's the kind of information that keeps the fire in our chest for the importance of working so hard, working together and collaborating to navigate this situation. So most of you in the audience, I believe, do know that 95% of students have the cognitive ability and can become skilled readers given effective instruction. But what's currently happening with reading proficiency in the nation? The National Assessment of Educational Progress, most of you may know this NAEP, or it's called the Nation's Report Card, tells us it collects information every 2 years. It started in 1969, and now every 2 years across different academic subject areas, from civics to economics to math, reading. They capture data for grade 4, grade 8, and grade 12. And so currently, only 32% of the grade 4 students in the nation are reading proficiently. And of that national public, only 17% of Black students are reading proficiently. So I'm going to give you a few more slides of some pretty devastating information, but like I said, it underscores the hard work that we're doing each day and some of the learning that we have to do as adults. So in addition to that, one thing I don't like to do is compare gaps between groups of people, but rather looking at different groups of people in relation to what's expected proficiency, if that makes sense. So 21%, and these are still grade 4 students. The grade 8 data is similar and some of it lower. 21% of Hispanic students are on track to be proficient readers, 10% of English language learners, and 9% of students with disabilities. So here in New York, where I live in New York City, you can look at the NAEP website and find your own state and find all the information about what's going on with your grade 8, grade 4, grade 12 students. In my state, 30% of the New York grade 4 students are reading proficiently. And in my home state of California, 31%. So this is just so we know, I know we had a pandemic and it caused many different types of concerns with students and with learning, but these data have not shifted very much up or down over the last few decades. So that's a clue that we have a true crisis. All right. So one other piece of information that we know is that students who are not reading proficiently by fourth grade are far more likely than their peers to struggle in school and in life. So let's talk about how devastating that can be. So 85% of juveniles who encounter the court system are functionally illiterate, and so are 60% of prison inmates. So we know 95% of children, and that means even to adults, can learn to read. And that also just reinforces our understanding that all of these children and adults do not have reading disabilities. It has to do with educator and leader knowledge and what we're doing in schools. The last slide I'm going to show you, which is very interesting, and you can go to this website to check it out. This is very interesting because literacy has a direct connection to not only your economic outcomes as an adult, but health and longevity. So this literacy map, you can hover over any county in the nation. I hovered over mine. So I live in Brooklyn, New York, which is called Kings County. And hovering over it, it showed me 33% of adults were lacking basic literacy skills. I hovered over another part of our city called the Bronx, and it showed me 49.9%. So that was pretty tough to see, but definitely check it out. When we talk about basic literacy skills, we're talking about adults being able to read a subway platform sign, a bottle of medication, or participate meaningfully in society by voting or advocating for their health. So be free to share this with your community because it's very important and helps us understand the work we do every day. So back to principles. So considering the impact that we learned effective principles have on student outcomes, and then considering the data I just shared with you about literacy proficiency for little ones all the way up to adults, it's fair to wonder if principles are so important in student achievement. What do current principals know about literacy? What do they know about multi-tiered systems of support? Are they well positioned to be literacy leaders in this work? And then I was also curious about something called self-efficacy. So I'm going to explain, I'll explain self-efficacy a little later. So here's what I found. Very few studies have investigated or can inform us about principal literacy knowledge, principal MTSS knowledge, or principal self-efficacy. There were a few studies I found about superintendents or central administration, but that's not quite the same thing as running a building. So let's take a look. I'm going to share what I found. The first study I found was not even in the United States. It was in South Africa and investigated the capacity of primary school principals with regard to literacy and instructional leadership. So their findings in this study revealed principals were lacking knowledge in literacy and database decision-making. They were not well positioned to support literacy teachers or literacy instruction in their schools. And the principals in this study noted that their workload and time constraints hampered their ability to monitor and interact with instruction. And if you remember the Wallace Foundation, that was one of the things they noted as something that effective principals are able to do. And that's something I hear school leaders say to me all the time. The constraints of the job, compliance, and things that need to be done keep them from being in the classrooms. There's another study that I found that asked similar questions, and this was done in rural Massachusetts. And it found that the principals felt knowledgeable about MTSS. They felt well prepared to implement the components like universal screeners, progress monitoring, and they felt they'd received quality training and that their schools were implementing it well. However, there were knowledge items in this study, and those revealed deep misunderstandings about literacy and MTSS. Also, in a focus group, principals expressed not feeling well prepared at all to lead data data collection and analysis. So in terms of self-efficacy, before I share the results of my study, I wanted to define this for you. I believe some of you may be familiar with the concept and some might not. In the 1970s, psychologist Albert Bandura defined self-efficacy as a person's belief in their own competence. So this belief in the ability to accomplish a task has a powerful influence over a person's efforts and willingness to persist through difficult circumstances. So there's a great deal of evidence about teacher self-efficacy and how it relates to student outcomes and strong student self-efficacy. Those who are familiar with the work of John Hattie know that one of the most powerful effects on student outcomes is teacher collective self-efficacy. So that's teachers together feeling very confident about what they can do in the classroom. That has a deep impact on students. So what about, oh, I'm sorry, I did not click. So what about principal self-efficacy? It's defined as a principal's belief in their capability to perform tasks that result in positive outcomes for their school, and it's related to their ability to persist towards goals, successfully lead, and motivate others. And this concept is not as widely investigated as teacher self-efficacy. There's one study that revealed there's a predictive relationship between self-efficacy and school administrator decision-making. That study showed that leader knowledge, self-efficacy, and beliefs predicted if they were likely to use evidence-based decision-making. So all of this is very interesting in relation to what I shared earlier about principal impact. But you can see there's only a few studies, and one huge limitation that the researchers in those studies pinpointed was that the participants in their sample studies were 97 to 100% white. And I think one study was all in a rural area. So why does this matter? It matters a great deal because the findings may not be generalizable to the broader groups of principals across the nation. So I decided to focus my study on a specific group, Black principals. And I learned very quickly that there is an underrepresentation of Black principals in the field and a lack of empirical research about them. So I also learned some of the historical factors that have contributed to this. So let's take a look at some of the context that's not widely known about the educator workforce in the United States. So my study contributes to the available quantitative literature on Black principals in the United States by investigating principals literacy and MTSS knowledge, self-efficacy, professional learning experiences, and relationships among variables. I'm not going to share all the findings and data today. You'll be able to hear if you follow the Center for Reading Science, they'll probably put information out. So there's going to be a symposium in January hosted by the Center of Reading Science and the Reading League chapter in Pennsylvania, where you will be able to hear about my study and several others of my classmates who graduated together. So what I am going to do is share the historical and social context and my findings about literacy and MTSS before we come back to center on the overall implications for the field and then look and talk about MTSS and next steps. So we're going to take a little trip through history very briefly. In 1899, W.E. Du Bois published a social study at the University of Pennsylvania, where he emphasized his notion on the importance of understanding and considering historical context, cultural dynamics, and institutional frameworks when approaching a topic. So something we can all reflect on when it comes to being an educator in our communities, we have to know our students well. We need to know our community well, and even our educators and leaders. Everyone has a story that impacts them and gives rich information about where they are and who they are. So that is how I approached my study. What we learned in our coursework, statistics, as we were preparing for research, is that when asking questions of a group of people that have not been previously studied or asked these questions, you have to provide descriptive information. In my case, it included a great deal of historical context. So prior to the Brown v. Board of Education decision, what was happening in the Black community when it comes to education and literacy? I, I, I think I might be speaking to a well-informed audience, so I'm not going to go through a full history of the institution of slavery, but I want to pull some understandings into your present mind so you can hold them there as I give you context for our present situation. So during the time of chattel slavery, there was a practice of withholding education and the opportunity to become literate. In order to preserve and protect the institution, shackles of the mind were legislated. So there were anti-literacy laws enacted in 1739 after the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. And those laws were passed in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and more. And they stayed in place from the 1740 to 1834 in those states. But as you know, human beings are resistant and resilient. People learn to read by hook or crook. There's one story of one woman, and I think there were many, who created a secret school. Her name was Matilda Beasley, and she was born in New Orleans, and she moved to Savannah, Georgia. And so even with the risk of being found out and punished, children would wrap their books in newspaper and alter their routes to get there and learn to read. So fast forward through Emancipation and Reconstruction era, we had the first Black PhD, Edward Alexander Boucher, graduating from Yale in 1876, and W.E. Du Bois from Harvard in 1895. And there was an acceleration of Black educators becoming credentialed and an intellectual revolution in the 1920s. So there were the first three Black women earned their PhDs in 1921. And during this pre-Brown era, Black teachers and principals were highly skilled, educated, credentialed, and the Black principal was a respected figurehead in the community. So this is a photo of Sarah Murphy. This is 1950 in Georgia in a two-room schoolhouse. So what happened next? Growing up, and these few slides that I'm sharing right now, I actually shared in a presentation a few weeks ago to a very diverse group of educators and administrators. We had from a 20-year-old, first-time teacher, all the way to I had an 80-year-old retired educator who was an author in the room, and every demographic and background. And I asked everyone, what did they learn growing up about not just the civil rights era, but what did they learn about this time period with the Brown v. Board of Education? Everyone shared their story. And I'd say this, some people had a wonderful, accurate, historical upbringing where they learned a good version of history, whereas some folks said they only learned something during February. And then the most common story was people learning a very basic story that goes like this, that there was segregation and there were laws called Jim Crow, and that Black schools were underfunded and under-resourced, that Black people wanted equality. There were activists that fought for civil rights. And then there was the court case, Brown v. Board of Education, where the Supreme Court decided that segregated schools were unconstitutional. And then the schools were desegregated. So we know it's much more complex than that. And there's a great deal of misinformation about the time period that a lot of Black scholarship in the social sciences has spent time to reinterpret and debunk. And I want to share some of the key understandings, loud noises outside, some of the key understandings that I learned myself as an adult when I got to college, and then some things I learned right now while I did this study. So 70 years ago, this past May, the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision to desegregate schools actually had a devastating consequences that are not widely known. So many reports about the era state that Black principals and teachers left their jobs in the field of education to take jobs that were previously unavailable to them during the Jim Crow era. And this was not the case at all. Nearly 100,000 Black educators and principals systematically lost their jobs. Terminations and demotions began even before the Supreme Court decision came. So that was something very interesting that I didn't know myself. This situation ushered in a culture of lower expectation for Black students and permanently diminished. I'm going to show you how terrible in the next slide, the number of Black principals and teachers nationwide. So the Black community sustained great economic loss over the decades to come. There's a book that I know you like to buy books. Put it in your cart. It's fascinating. Dr. Leslie Fenwick followed this trail of information, and it was not easy to put this story together. So if you get your hands on it, here's a quote that she has from the book. She said, "It wasn't until the 1970s that the nation began to reel from the fallout associated with what she calls the decimation of Black principals and teachers, the largest brain drain of expertise and talent ever experienced in the US school system." Pretty heavy. So prior to the Brown decision, just so you know, Black teachers and principals comprise 35 to 50% of the educator workforce in the 17 dual system states. So when I say dual system, those are the states that had Jim Crow laws. Right now, presently, no state even approaches those numbers. Here's a little bit of insight about the current Black principalship that I wrote about in my study. So there's evidence, this is really wonderful. There's evidence of the benefit of same race educators for the academic and future life outcomes for Black students. A Black student that experiences 1 to 2 Black teachers by grade 3 is 13 to 32% more likely to pursue higher education. Black principals are associated with hiring and retaining Black teachers and associated with higher academic achievement for students of color. And Black principals, something I also learned, spend more time as classroom teachers and experience delays before promotion to administration. I found that very interesting. So remember when I talked about the Wallace Foundation, and they reported diversity was slow to grow and most students of color were less likely to encounter same race principal. Here is the results of the history I just shared with you. Here we go. Yes. So out of 93,000 principals across our nation, only 9.4% are Black, but most quantitative research, as you recall, describes white principals, especially male. Out of 3.2 million teachers, only 7% are Black. And out of almost 14,000 superintendents, less than 3% are Black. One more piece of information, 70% of principals and teachers in schools where students are predominantly Black are white, and most Black students will never experience a Black principal, teacher, or model of excellence. So that leads me to my study. I'm going to give you a bit about who was the participants. I had 106 participants across 31 locations, 29 states and a federal district and Puerto Rico. About a third of the participants were from the southern part of the country and about a third from the western part of the country. What else? Most of the principals had less than 5 years of experience. They mostly had 6 to 10 years of overall classroom experience. And about a third of them, this is important later, had a little bit of experience as a K-3 teacher. So here's what I found. Remember the results from the 2 studies I showed you before. So surprise. I also found a deep misconception about literacy and MTSS. Many participants had an inaccurate understanding about the human brain. We know that the human brain is not born to read. Another misunderstanding was about the need for direct instruction. And other information that I collected that was very interesting, the principals reflected positively on their district and central support. They had varying levels of self-efficacy. So self-efficacy, that was interesting. I found higher self-efficacy ratings for teaching were related to teaching and learning and specifically evaluating teacher performance, and lower ratings were associated with workflow and managing performance. So more of the quality of life things associated with the principalship. So two surprising things. One was that a lengthier principalship was associated with feeling less confident about addressing performance issues. So that also speaks to uh, the quality of life and how the job might be wearing and tearing. And the most exciting thing that I found was principals with K-3 teaching experience had a more accurate understanding of direct instruction and confidence around leading data related tasks. So one thing I'll share with you, and we're gonna jump out of this into MTSS. One of my professors asked me at the time when I finished this study, Renata, what did you find that was different? And the answer was it was twofold. The answer was a resounding nothing. What I found was that Black principals had the same outcome as any other group of principals. And then the other thing that I found, the other answer to the question is I found that everything was different because of the historical story I just told you, which is important to know. So implications for the field overall, from the studies I shared with you earlier and from my own, it's important that we ensure principals are well informed with accurate information on reading acquisition and the components of MTSS, and for ensuring administrators at all levels have high quality professional learning on these topics. We have to pay attention to the real life pressures of the job. That's something that came through in my study. And it points to providing job embedded supports like coaching for principals and their teams. And it also spoke to recruiting K-3 teachers into the principalship. Diversification of the field, you can see, is something important. And then also having state level MTSS technical assistance and guidance. So let's talk about what basic things do we want educators, leaders to know about MTSS and best practices with literacy. There's some common misunderstandings, misconceptions that I found, and I wanted to talk about that. So when I said most of the principals thought that the born was born to read, it's important for us to understand if the brain is wired for reading or not, because that impacts what we understand about the kind of instruction that is important for students to have. Understanding that direct instruction is necessary for reading skills because reading is not a natural activity. It's a man-made activity, and so we have to learn it directly and explicitly. And the knowledge items for MTSS, many principals thought that MTSS was associated with, like a pipeline to special education, misunderstandings about the rationale. So let's talk about the rationale for MTSS. So some of the reasons we use an MTSS framework are, first, it helps us, we must proactively prevent failure. Think back to those first slides that I was showing you about the nation's reading proficiency, preventing failure instead of waiting to fail. We have to understand what level of support each student needs and why. We also need to, it helps us improve instruction for all students equitably and reduce referrals to special education. And last, it is we're collaboratively addressing systems level and student level needs. This is a slide I created for the principals in my district from last year. And this results, you may laugh at some of the things you see on the left side of the screen, but I put this together because it encompassed things I was hearing in the field. And I think you all of you, especially the ones who are interventionists or your MTSS specialists, understanding and having a common understanding of what something is or isn't can make us or break us. So here is a list of things that MTSS is not. So I have heard administrators tell me or say in groups and crowds that MTSS is a buzzword, it's jargon. It is not. It's something very, very important to our work. It's not exactly the same as RTI, which turned into something that was very much waiting to fail, the way that RTI has been implemented. It's not a term used to describe a time or a period. So we don't go to have MTSS time. And it's not something a student gets or receives. Oops. It's not a program or curriculum or a teacher or a room. And it's not a special education initiative or a direct pathway into placement. So what it is an enhancement of an RTI. It's a preventative, proactive framework or school model. One thing one of my mentors has told me, it's a way of thinking and being. It's a culture that's embedded in a school community, and the way we do things. It's a delivery system for evidence-based practices, structured literacy, and it's a general education initiative. So if you, I feel fine. There's a link I'm going to drop once I stop sharing afterwards to a document. I believe it's from the University of Southern Florida. They have a whole sheet that talks about myths and facts of MTSS. So you may have seen it before, but I'll drop it in the chat afterwards. So the components of MTSS, here are the ingredients of MTSS. Everyone, hopefully your schools are collecting universal screening data for all students. That is a key component. It answers the question, who may need help? And so all students are screened 3 times a year, in the beginning, middle, and the end of the year. And that data is used to check the health of students and also the system. We equate it to like GPS, or we equate it to like blood pressure, and tell us if something's going wrong. It won't tell us exactly what's going wrong. We have other assessments for that. The other component of MTSS, I didn't put the image of the triangle here, but tiered instructional support, meaning all students receiving a high quality tier 1 of core instruction. Students who are not getting all that they need from that may receive tier 2 supports. And then a smaller group of students who still have not reached benchmark or where as fast as we want may need tier 3 support. So that's the tiered instructional support component. And the other piece, progress monitoring. This is something that in my district, I'm helping everyone understand a little better. Sometimes teachers think this is a compliance thing. Oh, I just progress monitor the students, but it's not. This is in direct relation to what intervention may have been planned for a student. So it's hand in hand with that, and it answers the question if the support we're giving is causing growth. And if it's not, we want to change it. So it's something that's very, very crucial. It's not something that we just go through the motions and do. We want to pay attention to it and adjust our instruction so it's just right for students. And the last one that's to me, the most important, it's the glue that holds MTSS all together, is the database decision-making and effective teaming practices. So all of the adults together, understanding the data that's been collecting and making decisions. And if you were at the presentation last week with Larissa and Dr. Murdoch, you got to hear a phenomenal and see a phenomenal version of what this looks like going well. It's a well-oiled machine to get all these pieces in place and have them work well. And they're doing it there at Holy Family School in Ohio. So the last slide I'm going to show about MTSS is a quote. Once all those pieces are in place and moving well, and it's not as easy as that, this says, within the implementation of an effective MTSS initiative, students should move increasingly from the at-risk trajectory to a lower risk category so that the initiative meets the expected targets. So the point is all children are accounted for and their needs, and it does take a lot of coordination and collaboration of the adults. So what I ask the leaders I work with and, teachers I work with, what is within our control? I'm not a state legislator, so I know I can't change certain things, but what is inside my control to do? And here in my city, there's a lot of things rolling out, and I have a next slide that I'm gonna show you. But one thing that we can do is learn and share with each other, things that we've tried, tested, pitfalls and barriers. There's a number of states, and probably some of you on this call, who have been in this work for longer than others. And you've experienced things, rollouts, or made mistakes. And that's something we want to share with each other. So we're not so arrogant to think that we know how to navigate through the dark. Another thing that I've heard from some of my professors who are in states that have been in this for a while is not to hyper focus on curriculum implementation, um, but focusing mainly on the MTSS components and systemic change, fortifying the adult knowledge, and having a common language. There's there's nothing we can do. I think of analogies, giving someone a fishing pole who doesn't know how to use it, or
It's in
it's
the process. Do
in
you
the
get messages?
hands.
You get a message
Let's see.
on your watch?
Yeah, I do.
You do?
Okay, thanks. So putting something in the hands of someone that is not knowledgeable doesn't fix the situation. So those are some of the first things we need to do: strengthening our data literacy and teaming practices, and then supporting leaders and teachers in transferring that to practice. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing here in my district, and we're going to close up and see if you guys want to share. So, to give context, and I know I saw one of my colleagues here, who works with me in New York City, so he knows very well this story. We have 32 districts. It's a gigantuan school system. And within those 32 districts, we have almost 1 million students, 140,000 staff. It's massive. We have a chancellor over everything, and then each district has its own superintendent. So there's many levels above the school building itself. So if you can imagine, I'm sure all of you are experiencing different rollouts and changes to try to address what we're talking about here, which is our literacy crisis and getting it right. I'm sure you've experienced varying levels of what I'm going to describe to you. We've had new curriculum rollouts. We've had universal screeners from several years ago, rolled out for K-2. And at the time when that happened, I felt a little panicky because it was rolling out without first preparing leaders and letting people know what it was all about. And I felt like that made me very nervous, because when you roll something out and people don't understand, it might not land, it might get lost in translation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've been able to help and support do in my own district. And so within that gigantic New York City, we are the smallest district in Brooklyn, New York. We have 19 schools and just under 5,000 students. We have 13 elementary, 5 middle school, and 1 high school. And so what we've done is decided to focus on adult knowledge first. There's a lot of things coming at us. We realized our principals were overwhelmed and confused, because you're not sure what's the most important thing when there's so many things happening at once. So right now, and today we had a training that went wonderfully. We started with our leaders. Our leaders are in a cohort. They're learning about evidence-based reading practices and MTSS. We have 4 elementary cohorts. One of them is a cohort of in letters training, if you're familiar. So they've been in it for a year. This is their 2nd year. And we have 3 cohorts starting AIM training, which is it's all the same in the sense that they're getting that rigorous learning of the evidence base about how the brain learns to read and how to appropriately teach reading. We also have a secondary cohort, meaning grades 6 to 12, who are starting. And then in a few weeks, we're going to have an early childhood, our 3K and pre-K teachers. So my wonderful superintendent has embraced all of this and has a clear vision for we can't do this work if we don't know what we're doing, and everyone needs to be on the same page. So additionally, what we're doing is supporting the transition into practice. Our district team has has a different model of support for our schools. I'm going to show you some of the things that we are helping establish and ensure are going well, which for me, these are the quote basics, but the most important things, the building blocks. If you don't put these things in place, we won't be able to achieve that wonderful story that we heard last week at the Holy Family School, which is like a well-oiled machine. So adult knowledge, and then making sure teachers and leaders are trained in screeners, progress monitoring, and any other assessments trained properly. We're ensuring the integrity. When I say the integrity of the assessment data, I teach a course here at Mount St. Joe that is all about MTSS and remediating reading difficulties. And the students in that course they're all over the country. Actually, if someone is in Singapore, they're all over the world. They all were commenting on how this is going in their districts. And one of the things I kept hearing was that teachers hadn't received proper professional learning in administering screeners. And so then what kind of data comes out if I'm not well trained in the screener? So that's very important. We're also trying to certify Acadience mentors. If you don't use Acadience, it could be any screener that you're using, but having people certified who can actually deliver trainings and refreshers and shadow score and ensure that that data that we're using to make the decisions for the most important people in the equation, which are our students, is clean. We're helping our principals establish effective teaming practices, understanding who to include on a team and making sure they know how to run their meetings well and use data protocols. We're also helping make sure scheduling, having common planning for teachers is in place properly, and literacy blocks. So all of these things I'm mentioning are some of the systemic things that need to be in place for us to even get started with this work. So that is what we're up to here in New York City, and I would love to hear a little bit about where you are in the process or any questions you have. I have one slide here with resources, and I know we're coming to the end of our time. Some resources that you may have seen last week. So there's the book that I shared with you, which is fascinating. There's the effective, all of these are very nice teacher leader facing books. Effective Universal Instruction by Gibbons and colleagues. Next Steps in Literacy Instruction by Smart and Glasser. This was Dr. Murdoch's one of her favorite books, which is the MTSS, Multi-Tiered Systems of Support for Young Children. And then Larissa also mentioned this book last week, Keeping RTI on Track, and it's a small book. This QR code is for my my mentor, who was my dissertation chair, Dr. Stephanie Stoller. This is just one episode of her talking about MTSS. But if you follow her on Facebook, she has video after video where she is speaking about all the different ways to strengthen your MTSS model from each of the components. So this is a code to an interview she did on the Melissa and Lori literacy. So that is it. This is my thank you. That's my email address if you have any questions about universal screeners, universal screener data, interpretation, or MTSS. And that is all. So are there any questions or anyone want to share how things are going with MTSS and assessment processes in their district, leader knowledge?
Question, Renata. You shared a couple of slides back on the one talking about like what your focus was for your district, and you talked about some of the different things, like the initiatives that you took. How did you guys land on those, on that focus and on those initiatives? Yes, that one right there.
Okay. Yes, this very much came from, I think, the last 2 years feeling chaotic. So I tell people all the time, when I describe to you how large our school system here is in New York City, everyone means well. Everything that comes out is from a good, meaningful place. But you imagine a game of telephone. You remember the game of telephone and then how the message gets distorted by the end. So you imagine a massive system like ours when things are rolled out. Things that are rolled out, nice trainings, wonderful things and stuff, but it with may land ahead of the training, or it may land without understanding, and things can get lost in the sauce. So we, just like many of your states, had to choose curriculum. Each district had to choose one. We also had to choose foundational skill programs. That was just in the last 2 years. Before that, several years before that, we had the mandated K-2 screening, which is great. So, but rolling it out without preparing leaders first, preparing leaders and then preparing teachers. I witnessed a lot. At that time, I was still a coach, so I had eyes and ears all over the city to hear how this was happening. And when you hear teachers or leaders kind of reject it, you realize, ooh, this is not going to go well. You may understand how much rich data comes from a screener and how valuable it is to us to help a child learn to read. But when you just push things out and people don't understand, they are going to do it for compliance. They're not going to understand it or embrace it. So us landing on what we're doing right now, it literally was over the summer, I think sometime last June, us realizing we have to, what you call, stop the presses, stop and focus on the adults. You can't have a conversation or do this work if we're all speaking a different language. So that's what we decided to do. And the leaders, even my superintendent, is taking the course, and the executive leadership, the principals. So today we had a group of folks, 40 teachers in AIM. They had a wonderful time. Tomorrow we have a group. Tuesday, the principals have their conference and they're going to have their training. I I heard principals texting each other how they didn't do well on their pre-assessment. They're excited and so it's important that everyone speaks the same language before we can get into making decisions with data for students. So hope that helps.
And I can share, Dr. Archie. Hi.
Yes.
Hi. I'm glad that I could get home from my traveling and get on the meeting and share a little bit. So I've been working with Sarah Brown through the MTSS Data Academy. And we've had FastBridge since we actually piloted in 2020 in our school district. And so we're similar in size to your district. We have 10 elementary buildings, 2 middle and 1 high school. And so exactly what you're saying about us all speaking the same language. I think at the time when we got FastBridge, it was actually during COVID, and we got out of school early. And so the pilot schools, we only had 3 of our buildings do the pilot that year, but they got amazing professional learning through FastBridge because they had an early release time. And so they were really confident. And then the years since then, we wanted to replicate that at our other buildings. But I don't know about your district. We have a sub crisis. And so we didn't have enough subs to have the teachers and the administrators come in to get that refresh FastBridge and actually their initial FastBridge training. So what I've done, I'm a literacy coach. I'm the only one in our whole district. So I have recently worked with Sarah and gotten knowledge from her. And then what I did recently, we had a PLC meeting and we were talking about looking at progress monitoring graphs and the purpose of progress monitoring graphs to inform us, is the intervention working for the student to make catch-up growth or not? And so what I did, since I can't be in 10 buildings at once, is I recorded a video. It was about 12 minutes long, and I got really good feedback from the principals saying this was exactly what we needed. we're all speaking the same language, and now we really understand this piece. So I've been doing that at all of our data team meetings, having a short video just so that everyone's getting the same message, because we do have a reading teacher in every building, which is great, but they may present the slides differently than, what I'm learning from Sarah in the MTSS Data Academy, and then just really turning it around pretty quickly to get them that information. So that's been really, really great, and something I feel like, since I got the positive feedback, that I'll continue, because we all know that there's just not enough time for them to learn everything. So that's been great. And Sarah's amazing.
That sounds awesome. Yes. I mean, it just reconfirms for me, everyone's experiencing the same thing in all these locations. Last week, you talk about a video. We, on election day here, our kids are not at school, but we have professional learning. And we came together as a district, the principals, and they brought at least a few people from their instructional leadership team for us to do the same thing, just clear up some misconceptions, everyone get on the same page. And we had a great time. We had breakout sessions. We had almost 60 people on, and we had breakout sessions. And yeah, good stuff. Anybody else want to share what their experience has been with where they are on the journey of implementing MTSS, if you're just getting started? No? Well, thank you so much. I hope, Larissa, are people able to watch the video of you and Dr. Murdoch's presentation last week? Yes?
Yeah, I actually just shared that out yesterday with everyone who was registered. I know we had almost 250 registered for last week and this week. So folks who registered for tonight, we've recorded. We'll share this one as well. And then they'll also go up on our webpage at www.readingscience.org, and people can access past webinars as well.
Okay, that would be great. So that, connecting the dots. I'm so glad they happened, together. So talking about getting started and sorting through all the, just getting the first steps in place, and then being able to see the work that you guys are doing in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Where it can be, where it can go.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of those tools that we mentioned last week, again, those are available on our website. And I think too that we have a video on our website. I think we might have mentioned it last week, but just to throw that out there again for this group of people, if they weren't at the webinar last week, the school leader at Holy Family School in Cincinnati, she was featured in a Raising Reading Outcomes video available on our website. And I think it's just, Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's like 8-10 minutes long. And I think it really somehow captures the whole story, and it's very inspirational, and really gives you some really great things to think about for getting started. And I thought, how you really brought it all together there at the end, like getting focused on what it is that the adults need, and then those building blocks. And I think between last week's webinar and this week's webinar, it's a lot of great things to think about for getting started and aligning those systems.
Okay.
Rebecca,
Thank you so
I loved
much,
your
Dr.
example.
Archie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we appreciate you giving us your time, Dr. Archie. Thanks so much.
Yes,
Yes.
thank you everybody for coming.
Yeah,
Oh,
and our next
thank
webinar
you.
is about sound walls. Tambra Eisenberg should be a great one. So check out our website if you would like to register for that one. I think it's Monday, December 9th, if I recall.
Well, thank you so much. This was so informative. I'm Angela Archie, and
Aw.
I have several teachers, novice new teachers, that would have loved to be on, but school here in California is getting out when we started. So I understand that they can join and reach back and see some of these presentations. So I will be referring quite a few in the next week or so. Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah, we know the times don't work for everyone, so recordings are a nice way to catch up.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Archie.
Thank you. I said, thank you, Mommy. That's Mommy. Yes.
Education runs in the family, huh?
Yes.
Very
I love it.
cool.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Archie,
Thank
so
you, Dr.
much.
Thank you,
Archie.
everybody. All right.
All right.
Soon.
Bye.
See you later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Larissa. Sorry, it was a little late coming on.
Oh, that's okay.
I had
I
another
see you're
meeting
still the center.
that was just ending, and for some reason I was thinking 7 o'clock, and then I looked at my time. I was like, oh no, it's right, it's 6 o'clock. I missed part of it.